My name is Jane McPhee, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our coffee chat with the Saskatoon Council on Aging on the topic of things to consider when renting. I hope you enjoy the presentation today with our law students, Bridget Morrison and Taylor Schlamp. For guests who may be new to the Saskatoon Council on Aging, we offer many services, including information, referrals, and resources of interest to older adults, free monthly social programs, including our seniors neighborhood hub clubs, lifelong learning programs, a telephone buddy program. We have seniors mastering technology programs, and our Century Club for those 90 years and older. Our Globe Walk program, some of you may be familiar with, our program to keep you motivated during winter months by forming teams and staying active. Our free directory of services and activities for older adults is available. We have monthly newsletters to keep you informed about all our events. We have caregiver information and support services. We identify and act on unmet needs of older adults and support them to lead healthy, independent lives and to be active and socially engaged. Now, to reach the Council on Aging, you can call us anytime at 306-652-2255 to find out more. If you have any questions during the webinar, please click on your chat icon. Some it'll be in the top and some in the bottom of your right-hand side of your screen, and then type your questions into the chat box. There are some students who are standing by who are available to provide technical support if you need that. And that number is 306-966-2496. You can call them anytime. I'd now like to welcome our moderator for today. Elliot Pozjensen is a tireless advocate for older adult issues such as elder abuse, senior-to-senior bullying, and human rights of older adults. Elliot is a longtime volunteer with SCOA, including being a former board president, and she's presently a member of several SCOA committees, including the Age-Friendly Community Development Committee, and the subcommittee of that group, who have been working with our guests on older adults' rights in rental living situations. She's a retired social worker who has worked for many years with older adults with complex health and functional issues and their families. So I'd like to welcome Elliot Pozjensen.
Thanks so much, Jane, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It really is a pleasure for me to be here today and to take part in our coffee chat today. I hope everybody has their coffee or tea. I have mine right here, and that you will enjoy our conversation today with Taylor and Bridget. I hope you'll join the conversation too by asking questions in the chat box. I'm just so pleased to introduce Taylor and Bridget today. Both of them are first-year law students. Now, Bridget is also a registered social worker and has degrees in social work and a Bachelor of Arts in psychology as well. And her interests include public policy, rights-based policy development, knowledge mobilization, and access to justice issues. And certainly that's what we're looking at too. Now, Taylor has studied sociology with an emphasis on, let me see here, criminology, deviance, and social control. And while she was a student, she did some very interesting work at a nonprofit organization for people with disabilities and also in providing respite. So both Bridget and Taylor are with us today because they responded to SCOA's request for law students to Pro Bono Students Canada, because we were interested in getting some help in trying to understand legal issues regarding renting. And we made this request because of the challenges older adults have told us over the years as they've tried to navigate the rental landscape. So we're just delighted to welcome Bridget and Taylor today, who can give us, I want to say, information about legal issues, but they can't give legal advice. Taylor and Bridget, can you just tell us briefly about Pro Bono Students Canada, and why, in your very demanding first year of law school, why you chose to undertake this work with us.
Sure, yeah. So Pro Bono Students Canada is a nationwide organization. It's made up of lawyers and law students. And so they provide a variety of services, such as research, public legal education, court assistance, and legal clinics. And the goal of Pro Bono Students Canada is to provide free legal support for people and communities who face barriers to justice.
Great. And so why did you decide to, it's a great organization. We certainly need that kind of advice and help. So why, when you've got such a busy academic year, did you decide to do this project, which we knew would be demanding?
So I personally chose to do this project because one of the main reasons I wanted to go into law school was my interest in human rights issues and human rights law. And I felt that for this specific project, my experience working with people with disabilities gave me a solid foundational education background to be able to conduct the research. And it was just something I was really interested in learning more about.
Well, I have to say that we're really glad that you did. And Jane and I, along with Cynthia Johnson, who's a staff person, had the privilege of working with Bridget and Taylor on this project. And we learned so much from you. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of our conversation today. Now, legal issues aren't something that most of us have thought of throughout our lives. And when we're looking at, perhaps moving out of our home, looking at the options available to us, looking at renting, there's just a million things to think about. And most of us never think about legal issues. Why should we think about legal issues? Why is it important?
So the main reasons to consider legal issues when you're looking at renting is that it's important to consider for a number of reasons. Firstly, the law governs the relationship between the tenant and the landlord, and it provides protections and obligations for both sides. So it can deal with issues such as ensuring that a landlord is upholding the services that they've agreed to provide to you in your lease agreement. And it also provides a framework for how to deal with a situation where a tenant breaches something in the lease.
Okay, well, that does sound like a good reason, all right. So how does the law affect us as renters? You've answered some of that already, but are there other things we should know about how the law affects us?
So the main thing for renters to consider is the legislation surrounding rental agreements in Saskatchewan. So the most important piece of legislation to look at is called the Residential Tendencies Act. And within this act, it outlines rights and obligations that renters and landlords have. Another piece of legislation that can come into play is the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code.
So the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code applies to renting as well, does it? And what does it provide for renters?
So the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code is an overarching piece of legislation. So it applies to your tenancy agreement. It protects you from discrimination in your agreement and from your landlord. The Human Rights Code says that discrimination in rental properties and in contracts is prohibited. And so that means on various factors, which includes age, race, and disability, you cannot be discriminated against.
So that means that they can't deny you an apartment on those bases, and they can't kick you out either on those bases?
Yes, that's correct. Generally, yes, that's correct.
Good. Okay. Now, the Residential Tenancies Act actually is of interest to some of us old timers at SCOA, because back in about 2012, we were among groups who reviewed the removal of the exemption of the Residential Tenancies Act to housing for people over 55 that included meals with the rent. And we said it was age discrimination and that it should be removed. And so it was at that point, and the legislative branch that was looking at this agreed, and they removed the exemption. But, to be perfectly honest, we really didn't know much about the Residential Tenancies Act and what kinds of protections that it gives. And you had mentioned, Taylor, when we should look at consider legal issues, that it does offer protection. So what does the Residential Tenancies Act do?
So first and foremost, when you get into a rental agreement, it is a form of contract law. So all of the laws that affect it are centered around that lease agreement. So that piece of paper you sign right off the bat. So how the Residential Tenancies Act comes into play is, as the title implies, it's focused on tenants in residential agreements. So that makes the rules different from, for example, when a corporation is leasing a building to run their business within. So it really works to provide a higher level of protection for residential renters than it does for corporations or businesses.
Okay, and I think that's what seniors had told us. They needed some level of protection. Now, you mentioned rental agreement, and what is a rental agreement?
So a rental agreement is a legal contractual agreement that's signed between two parties. So for someone renting an apartment building, it's going to be signed between you and then the landlord, which can be a person, a corporation, a nonprofit. But the main thing that the rental agreement does is it outlines exactly what you're getting into by renting. So it'll include things like what rent's going to be, when you pay rent, what types of services are going to be offered, grounds that the landlord can evict you on, ways you can breach. So the lease is your contract for living in whatever rental situation you're going to live in.
Yeah, that sounds very important. Now, is that, sometimes we read about a tenancy agreement. Is that a lease agreement? Are those, and rental agreements, are those all the same thing?
Yes.
Just different words for the same thing?
Yeah, different terminology for the same thing.
Okay. Did you want us to add something there, Bridget?
I was just going to say they're all used interchangeably, but they all refer to the contract between you and the landlord.
Right. Okay. I think it's sometimes with the different terms being used for different things that makes things a little complicated. You think there's a slight twist. So that's very useful information for us to know, that's for sure. So what types of rental situations does the Residential Tenancies Act cover?
So the Residential Tenancies Act covers anything defined as independent living. So independent living is anytime you are renting something residentially. So that can include assisted living, which is a type of independent living that includes different services. So for example, your rental agreement might include hot meals, or it might include housekeeping, but as long as it isn't defined as a long-term care home, it's going to fall under the Residential Tenancies Act. So any agreement you get into that isn't a care home will fall under it.
Okay, so so this is going to cover virtually all seniors housing then, not except for the care facilities, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So care facilities in Saskatchewan are often referred to as nursing homes or long-term care.
Right.
And the main difference here is that to be in a long-term care home, you actually have to go into an agreement and have a defined amount of healthcare or nursing care hours that are going to be provided a day. So you're going to know if you're getting into one of these situations because there's an application process and they will evaluate the person to see if they're eligible to be in the care home. And then you will be placed based on your medical needs. So some examples in Saskatoon here are Sherbrooke and Parkridge, but these types of homes are governed by completely different legislation. So they don't fall under the Residential Tenancies Act, and they are under a completely different legislative model. So you'll know if you're getting into that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the confusion really is probably more for older adults when we're looking at, again, so many terms being used. We read about and see ads for independent living, for retirement living, for enriched seniors living, for assisted living. And so, people start to wonder, well, are there any differences between enriched housing, between assisted living, between etc. Anyway, so is there any legal implications for those names that would require, for example, if you advertised yourself as a retirement living, that you would have to offer specific services? that you wouldn't have to if you advertised yourself as, say, independent living.
So I agree. This is definitely the area that things get most confusing. And this actually took me and Bridget quite a while to nail this down. But so essentially all of the terms being used are arbitrary. So if I have a building that I'm renting out, I can call it a retirement home and I can choose to only have 65 plus. I can call it assisted living, or I can call it independent living. So for example, Ontario uses the term retirement homes in some of their legislation, whereas in our legislation, you're not going to find that terminology because we refer to it as different stuff. But the main thing to keep in mind when you're trying to navigate your way through the different terms is that assisted living is the same as independent living. The only difference is it provides a broad description that the renter is going to be provided with some type of service more than just renting the space. So there's no set guidelines for what that service can be or can't be, or what has to be included. The examples we gave earlier with the housekeeping or the meals being provided are good examples. But once again, like, it's all arbitrary and there's no set definitions. So that's why it's so important to go back to your lease agreement, because even if somewhere calls themselves a seniors assisted living facility, they're not legally held to provide you anything except for what they give you in that lease agreement. The only exception is with the private care homes and the long-term care homes. Those are both legal terms. Tying back into what I mentioned earlier, those are going to be governed by a completely different legislative scheme. So you're not going to use the Residential Tendencies Act for those. So like, the most important thing is when you're renting a place, ask if you don't know if it's a private or a long-term care home. And if it's not one of those, then it's going to fall under independent living.
Great. Well, this is, I think this has been this is the issue that is so challenging for seniors, because personal care homes are outlined in legislation, because the special care homes are, the long-term care homes are as well. And in some provinces, as you mentioned, retirement homes or assisted living or whatever are also outlined, and especially for people who move from other provinces, it just gets very, very difficult to navigate. And so, but what we need to look at here is that the Residential Tenancies Act applies to all seniors housing, really, until we get into care facilities, personal care homes or special care homes. And it doesn't matter what the home chooses to call itself. We remember the term, I think your use of the word arbitrary is a very important one for us to remember, that it's arbitrary. The facility can choose whatever label they choose to put on it, as long as they don't say personal care home, which they wouldn't want to, because they have to meet certain qualifications. As you said, it's a care facility. Well, this has been very, very helpful, I have to say. So, and I think we were going to talk about the type of housing that the Act doesn't cover. And I think you covered that very well, Taylor, in your explanation. It does not cover personal care homes or long-term care homes. And I think we were going to talk about the fact that homes, or at least the question I had was if a lot of homes offer different services. And I was wondering if the fact that they offered more services, that complicated things legally.
So first and foremost, the most important thing you can do when asking anything about the services provided is to check that lease agreement, because whatever is in writing, that's your agreement, and under contract law, that's what has to be held. So if there's something in your lease agreement, say for example, it says you are to be provided a certain number of meals per week, and your landlord or your residence isn't providing that to you, that can give you an avenue to either break your lease and get out of that agreement, or you can have that remedied and have them uphold their end of the bargain and provide what they said they were going to provide. So the deal that you strike when you sign that agreement is that the landlord is going to provide the services that are listed, and you're going to abstain to the obligations that are in there. If you do have difficulties, though, if you think something was implied or something in your lease is not being done, the thing you can do is contact the Office of Residential Tenancies, and they will resolve the issue between you and the landlord, or they will either enforce that the service be upheld, or they will direct you towards a way to break that lease agreement.
Right. Okay, so so we're back to where we started, and that is basically that legal issues are really, really important, and we have to check that lease, check that lease, check that lease, and if we're not sure, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. And for many of us seniors, that's one of the hardest things to do, is to overcome the hesitancy to ask. But what you've been saying is this is just so important. We just have to do that. Yeah, thank you. So we sort of touched on this a bit too, but is there anything more that we should talk about with the landlord has legal obligations or responsibilities to tenants through the Act, and what are they? And is the landlord accountable to any government agency for how it meets its obligations?
So as you mentioned, the landlord does have obligations that stem from the contract or the lease agreement, whatever you're calling it. And there is the relevant legislation, as I mentioned, the Residential Tendencies Act and the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. So essentially what the landlord does has to fall within the guidelines of the lease. It has to fall within the guidelines of the Residential Tendencies Act, and it can't discriminate based on the Human Rights Code. So if your landlord is doing something that you think contradicts any of those three pieces of legislation, that's the time that you need to contact the Office of Residential Tenancies, because they aren't upholding their end of the deal and the contract. There are obviously municipal things like, you know, most apartments need to have a working fire alarm. Most buildings need to have a CO2 detector, but those are kind of on the side. And it's just those three main pieces of legislation that you need to focus on.
Okay, good. Okay, so the landlord has some responsibilities to me as a tenant, and do I as a tenant have any legal responsibilities or obligations to as well?
Yeah, so the tenant also has legal obligations that fall under the three pieces of legislation that Taylor just mentioned. So under the contract, you have obligations. Under the Residential Tenancies Act, you have obligations. And under the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, there's also obligations. And again, if an issue comes up, that's when you go to the Office of Residential Tenancies. For example, an obligation of a tenant would be to pay rent at the agreed upon time. And all of that will be outlined in your lease. And that's why it's very important to make sure you read through that thoroughly when you go to sign, so you understand what your obligations are.
Yeah. So we do have obligations, and we have to make sure that we have to look at the lease. Now, what about rights? We had, when we were talking about Residential Tenancies Act at the beginning, we said that it offers a certain protection in terms of our rights. What rights would I have as a tenant?
So you can kind of think about it the flip side of the obligations of a landlord. So if the landlord has an obligation to provide a facility that is maintained and clean, then you as a tenant have a right to live in a facility that is maintained and cleaned. So you can kind of look at the obligations of a landlord and think about those as your rights. And that's, like Taylor previously said, when they're not upholding their end of the contract, that's when your rights have become interfered, and that's when you can go to the Office of Residential Tenancies.
So you had mentioned a clean up place, one that's well maintained, that is safe, I assume, with fire protection and doors that lock and things like that. And then if they're offering services, that the services be of a good standard.
Mm-hmm.
And with human rights delivered in a respectful way, so that they're not discriminating because you're old and think that you don't need as much or whatever.
Exactly. And yeah, and that's a main issue that comes up with older adults. And that's really, really important to emphasize here, is that under the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, you cannot be discriminated against based on age. And if that's happening again, then you can go to the Office of Residential Tenancies and they'll help you from there.
Okay, right. Okay. So can I insist that everything in my tenancies agreement be in writing? Is it legally acceptable that some of it is written and some of it is not?
Yeah, so generally speaking, tenancy agreements must be in writing. That's required. So for any lease agreement that is 3 months or longer, or is a fixed term, let's say like 6 months or 1 year, they must be in writing. So the only exception to that is when a lease is month to month. And most often leases are fixed term or longer than 3 months. So it's rare that you'll find a contract that isn't required to be in writing. And all of the fundamental terms will be included. So your rent payments, what services and facilities are included, the date that the agreement's entered into, everything is required to be in writing.
Okay, so yeah, that is a question that has come up because sometimes a verbal agreement, when obviously there was a disagreement as what that verbal agreement was, that has been an issue that has come up for us. So really everything should be in writing except when it's a month to month. Was that what you said? A month to month?
Yeah,
lease.
that's correct. The month to month lease doesn't have to be in writing.
Okay. So, I mean, often month to month leases are promoted as you don't need to worry about having a lease. So a month to month agreement is a good thing to have. I mean, this is what facilities sometimes say. Are there any downsides to having a month to month lease?
Well, I guess we can just bring it back to what we were really just saying, is that a month to month can be changed more easily. So if you're going month to month, the landlord might go, you know what, I'm going to change it in this month. And so it's really important, if you're in a month to month lease, to check back and read through it every single time, because those conditions might change. So if 1 month you had this however many meals a week and the landlord says, this month I'm going to change it, but maybe doesn't verbally tell you, but you've signed on to it, then that's what's in the contract. So it's super important for month to month to read that. Otherwise you might miss things.
Yes, I can see easily how that would happen. All right. You would just assume that it was the same as the month before, and it maybe you forgot your glasses. I forgot my glasses or whatever, and you don't read it, or you're in a hurry and you don't read it as very carefully, and then it's been changed, and you've got your signature on it, and it's been changed. So month to month, it can be changed more easily. So in other circumstances, when it's not month to month, can the landlord change that tenancy agreement?
So in certain circumstances, yes. Ultimately, it depends on what the change is. So with every tenancy agreement, there's something called standard conditions. And with every written tenancy agreement, this will be included. It's a form that will be included, and it outlines all the obligations. It outlines things such as security deposits, when rent is due, really all the details that are very important. And so standard conditions cannot be changed at all, and without your knowledge at all. So
I just again, so this is a new term, standard conditions, and that's part of all the, it's a legal thing that must be in all leases, that these things are dealt with in all leases. Is that
yeah,
right?
so with every tenancy agreement, there'll be a form attached, and it outlines the standard conditions. And basically what that is all the obligations of the landlord and the tenants. So how a tenancy agreement ends, paying rent, security deposits, all the aspects of the rental agreement will be in there. And that's what cannot be changed. There are very, very few exceptions when a landlord can change an agreement without your approval. So my answer would be, generally, your agreement cannot be changed without your approval.
Okay, generally not, but obviously a few exceptions. Now, Bridget, in this project, we were going to be looking at some of the pandemic related issues, but because it all turned out to be so much more complicated, which I have to confess I was really afraid of anyway, we never did get to that. But can I just throw you a question, and you can tell me if it's not fair, or that you don't know it. My understanding is that in emergencies, as the pandemic is an emergency, then human rights law can be waived on a temporary basis if it's proportionate, if it's meets certain criteria such as that. For a short time while the emergency is on. So in a situation like this, then the landlord has been able to change the agreements because of the emergency. For example, not allowing you to have visitors.
Well, Taylor and I didn't look into this, so I don't want to say anything and give incorrect answers.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough, Taylor. I mean, Bridget, and we did not have time to get into that. It is because we're in an emergency now. I think that there have been some changes too in everybody's in the way we live in every way because of the pandemic. And so we'll just leave that for now and leave that as an aside. So another thing that seniors worry a lot about when they're in housing of any kind is being evicted when their needs increase. So can the landlord make you leave your apartment if you don't want to?
So there's a couple of answers based on the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of an aside, but I think it's important to note that in a housing program, which is subsidized, the short answer is yes, the landlord can evict you because it's based on need. So let's say you're one individual and you're in a 2-bedroom apartment and a family moves into this subsidized unit, and their need is that they need more space. They've got a larger family. The landlord can evict you to a smaller unit in that case. But in standard rental agreements, which what we're discussing today, the independent living, the answer is it depends. There's a very fine line. So the main takeaway that I would give for this question is if your needs increase to the point where your needs can't safely be met by the landlord, or there's a risk to others, then the landlord can evict you.
Okay. Yes, okay, so we just have something come up on all our screens. The pandemic led health authorities to dictate to retirement homes to, yes, I mean, this is an emergency and that is what is happening now. And it is recognized under human rights law that sometimes emergencies happen when things have to be changed. Yeah, thank you, Martin Zip. So I'm back to being evicted. So I think many of us have friends who were in subsidized housing. I certainly have one, and my friends went in as a part of a couple, and then her husband had to move to long-term care, and so she then had to move to a smaller apartment because somebody else needed that subsidized place, and so that you certainly covered that, and then if when your needs increase, if you then become at harm, causing harm to somebody else, to other people, or if the landlord can't meet your needs, safely meet your needs, then there's a fine line, and he may be able to insist that you leave.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what if you disagreed, Bridget? What if you disagreed with the landlord here?
So
I mean, one of the things is that very often seniors want independence. They want to live their lives as they are living them now and to take some risk. And healthcare and often families are risk averse. And so you have a situation where a senior feels, hey, what I want for my life is this. I want to take a little risk, and the family and the facility management in good faith are saying, we don't want you to take that risk. So what happens here?
So like you said earlier, it's always really, really important to ask questions. So if there's someone that you trust and you can ask questions to, that's great. But again, I'm going to go back to the Office of Residential Tenancies. If you don't have to accept something that your landlord says at face value. If you think, you know what, I think he might be a little off base, we're in a disagreement here, and I'm not sure actually if what he's saying is true, it's in your best interest to contact the Office of Residential Tenancies, and they'll help you navigate that dispute.
Right. Yeah, sometimes there are going to be basic philosophical differences where everybody is acting in good faith, but have come to different opinions as to what should happen. And so it is very useful that there is a place. And can you tell us a little bit about this Office of Residential Tenancies? I know it's been mentioned before, and it sounds like an important resource that I never heard of before we started this work with you.
Yeah, so the Office of Residential Tenancies is an independent of government agency. So they provide information about rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants, and they will help resolve disputes. And there's a whole process, and it's quite a bit, I think, to go through today. But if you are able to use the computer, you can search Office of Residential Tenancies, and it'll outline exactly the steps that you would need to follow in order to help to get some help to resolve a dispute. So they're an independent agency outside of the government that will step in and hopefully provide you with some help. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is very important because often, well, seniors haven't been through this before. I mean, I bet I'm not the only one in the audience today who had never heard of the Office of Residential Tenancies Act before, or residential tenancies before we undertook this work. It's not something that's commonly known. So it is important to know that there is an agency out there that can help you understand the legal ramifications in various ways and to help you navigate through. I think this is something that we should probably put up in our chat box too for everyone, because this is, as you said, something that we can look up on the internet. And for those who don't have internet services, I know that at least in one instance, and I'll bet more, Betty, who answers the phone at SCOA, has looked up the phone numbers. She's looked up numbers. She's helped people who haven't had internet access themselves. She's helped them navigate some of the things that they otherwise were unable to do. So this is, and I'm sure people have families that can help them as well. Many people anyway. So that is really, really important. Those are really important issues here. Well, I think I've asked a lot of questions to the two of you. Is there anything that you would like to say just before we turn it over to see what's in the chat box and see what other questions we have coming up?
I guess I would just reiterate two things. One, that really be confident in asking questions. It's okay to ask questions, and it's really important to. So if you're having trouble understanding your agreement or you're not sure what your rights are, ask questions, reach out. You can ask your landlord, you can go to the Office of Residential Tenancies. It's really, really important to make sure you understand that, or have someone that you can go to who can help you navigate any situation that arises where there's a dispute or you don't understand something.
So, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I guess I agree with everything Bridget said, but the one thing I would add too is before you sign that lease agreement, you should really read it through, have someone you trust read it through with you. Don't sign anything until you understand everything in it. And if there is, there's a service or there's a term in there that you're not understanding, don't just sign it without figuring out what that means. Negotiate with the landlord, talk to the landlord, and then that way you can avoid hopefully having to contact the Office of Residential Tenancies.
Yeah. So really, what you're telling us, we really have to overcome our real reluctance to ask questions. You know, when I was a social worker working in healthcare, I found that very often people would sit through medical explanations of what was happening without asking questions. And I remember one time a lawyer stopped a doctor and said, excuse me, but what you call a myocardial infarction, is that what we lay people would call a heart attack? And I thought, you know, you have to have a certain level of comfort before you can ask what you think somebody else is going to think is a dumb question. But really, we have to get over that and say, okay, this is a new territory for us. We don't understand. We have to clarify, what does this mean? What does that mean? And what are the implications for me? And take the time to do it. I think that is really, really good advice, and make sure that we understand everything that's in it, and have somebody else come with us, because, you know, we're often trying to be nice and we can't be nice. So I see there are quite a few questions coming up. And so I see one right here. You probably see it on the, well, let's go to the chat box. Is it okay?
Elliot, would you
Yeah.
like me to read the questions for you?
That would be great, June. That would be wonderful.
Okay. I'll just start from the very first question we have
Okay.
here. Is the office of the residential tenancies the same as the rentalsman?
So I believe so. I think that term is interchangeable. Like, I think the residential tenancies office is a form of rentalsman. Bridget, did you find anything about that?
No, but I think you're pretty on par with that answer, but I couldn't say for certain.
Okay, so this is something that we can look up afterwards, and maybe if the person who asked us, you know, emails into the office, we can try to answer that question. Yeah, okay.
All right, the next question is, are the rules set in the Residential Tenancy Act of 2006 and the Residential Tenancies Regulations of 2007 deemed to be only guidelines for landlords to follow as they see fit, or are there laws and regulations that have to be followed? And this person mentioned that their landlord had increased their rent without notice because he had to keep the rent the same as everyone else in the building. And this person moved there in August, and 5 months later in January, the rent went up a couple of percentage points. The landlord is talking about changing from a key system to a keyless system for the main entrance doors. Does he need permission for that? And when I move into a rental unit, is it a requirement that the landlord and I do an inspection of the unit? What if it isn't followed by the landlord? What happens if the landlord withholds my security deposit because he claims I damaged something which I dispute? Can the landlord withhold the deposit? This is all from one person, these questions.
Okay, well, we'll move through those. We'll start with the first one. So the rules, if they're set or guidelines. So those are laws and regulations that do have to be followed. And so again, if that's not happening, that's when you can raise an issue with the Office of Residential Tenancies. Those, but I will say,
They're not guidelines, they're more than guidelines.
yeah,
Yeah.
They're upheld by law, so they can't be breached.
mm-hmm. In terms of changing the key system,
The rent.
oh, the rent, sorry, I skipped one.
My landlord increased the rent without notice.
So I think there's a couple different, Taylor, jump in anytime. I think there's a couple different factors that come into play here. So the type of lease that you have will be important. What is outlined when you sign the lease. So often landlords will put a disclaimer out front, or they'll include in the agreement saying, I can change the rent at any time. And if you sign to that, then they can. So again, that goes back to making sure you read that agreement off the bat, because they can include things like that in the agreement. But I will direct you also to the standard conditions, because that is where you will get kind of the general answers to these questions that you can kind of plug your facts into, and hopefully get some clarity on. Taylor, do you have anything to add to that?
Just with that one, as Bridget said, like standard conditions are something that should be in every lease. To answer that question better, like we would, like she said, we would have to know what type of rental agreement it was. But if I were to assume it wasn't a month to month, and that you didn't sign anything saying that you gave away your right to have the rent changed at any time, then that is definitely an issue to take to the Office of Residential Tenancies. That would be something that they could remedy. I guess then we can move on to the key system one. So this one's a little tricky because the type of key entry might not be something included in the terms of the lease. So if it's not in the terms of the lease, then it's neither an obligation, a right, a standard condition, anything like that. And so it's good that your landlord brought that up with you. If you are uncomfortable with the new type of system with the keys, once again, you could go to the Office of Residential Tenancies, but that one I think is like less likely, just because it's not something that's so central to the lease. And if it does provide the same level of security as the keyed entry, then there might not be as much you can do about that one. Bridget, correct me if I'm going off track on that.
I think that's fairly correct. However, I did pull up the standard conditions just so I could provide a little bit more clarity. There is a whole section on change to locks and access to the building. So that's at section 12. So it's a little bit long, so I won't read it out here, but that should provide some clarity. But essentially what it's saying is that that there is agreement that's needed when locks are being changed. So I guess it looks like the landlord does have to check with you, the tenant, and get your go ahead on that, I guess.
I guess moving on to the next question about the inspection and the security deposit. So this is a really, sorry to beat a dead horse here, but this is a really common situation that does go to the Office of Residential Tenancies, and often it goes all the way to small claims court. So essentially, if you want an inspection, that's something that you should have the landlord agree to before you sign that lease. Like that's something you'd want to negotiate and say, I want to do an inspection or take photos or whatever before I sign this. And then on the second part, if the landlord is withholding that security deposit because they claimed you damaged something, but you don't think you did, that's the perfect time to go to the Office of Residential Tenancies, because they will first try and resolve it. And then if not, that's something where you would need to get a lawyer and go to small claims court over that damage deposit.
Okay, the next question is, how do you prove discrimination based on age?
Bridget.
That's a big question, and I'll just say from my understanding, it can be really, really difficult. And that's to prove any discrimination, particularly age, can be quite difficult. I don't have a lot of specific points on how to go about doing that, but if you thought, you know what, this is what happened and you need some support and you want to move forward with that, there's a process for making complaints. And that goes through the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. And that would be where I would direct you. I don't want to say anything that's incorrect, but that's where I would direct you. And then you could go through the process of filing a complaint. And then you would go through sharing what happened in the experience and all the steps that happen in the process with the Human Rights Commission. I don't know if you have anything to add, Taylor, but I don't want to step too out of line and say something that's incorrect. So I think I would direct you towards the commission and they would help you out there.
Yeah, I think you answered that one exactly how I would. Probably better.
Okay, next question was, will you offer referrals to the rental agencies that tenants have made many complaints about?
Sorry, I'm trying to understand the
Oh,
question.
sorry, I read that wrong. We offer referrals to the rental rights group and the tenant legal assistance organization.
So I'm actually, personally, I'm not familiar with, I was pulling that up on Google and I'm not sure what the tenant legal assistance organization or the rental rights groups are. Maybe if like whoever asked the question could just clarify.
Yes, I'm not aware of them either. So it would be very useful to have this information. But in the meantime, yeah.
In the meantime, then the next question is there a list of landlords or rental agencies that tenants have made many complaints about?
So when I was researching, I saw that a lot of people were pushing for the Office of Residential Tenancies to have a blacklist of landlords that have, had numerous complaints brought forward. I currently, and I could be wrong here, so take this with a grain of salt. I currently don't think that type of list exists, but you could always look up your landlord's name in a legal database, and if they do have any, small claims or anything brought like that against them, that would be one way. But other than that, I don't think that currently exists.
So how would you look up? I mean, I never heard the legal database either before, Taylor. As I said earlier, we learn so much every time we talk to Bridget and Taylor. So what is the legal database and how would we access it? That's a very good, useful piece of information to have.
So the best website to go to that's free is called Canlii, CANLII. And basically when I was doing research, I looked up some case law around rental agreements in Saskatchewan. So sometimes they do just have the initials of the people that are involved in the case, but sometimes there are last names or, the name of the rental property is in there. So if you are considering renting somewhere, you can either look up, say you want to rent from Sherbrooke, look up Sherbrooke, see if that's anywhere in a legal case, look up the landlord's name. It's fairly easy to use. There's a search bar at the top. You can search terms and narrow it to Saskatchewan. And then if there is any concerning legal cases, they will be listed there. And once again, if you need help with this is something you can go to someone you trust or someone with legal knowledge or the Office of Residential Tenancies even.
And I would add in to that, I know personally, I have done this when I've been apartment hunting, is just by word of mouth. If there's anyone who lives in a certain building that maybe you're considering moving into, I would ask, what's your experience with the landlord? Have they been receptive to you when you've come to them with issues? Just even by word of mouth, looking into that, because you can find some stuff online, like Taylor said, and that's actually a very good resource to have, but you won't always. So again, ask questions and do a little digging and see what you can find on your own too is helpful.
Okay, I have a question here.
Before we go on, June, that person did answer about referrals to the rentals group. Just in the meantime, the stakeholder is Renters of Saskatoon and Area, ROSA. I have heard of ROSA, Renters of Saskatoon and Area. This is very interesting. We need to make note of this at the SCOA office. And tenant poverty legal assistance is provided by Classic Law. Do either of you know about Classic Law? Maybe
Bridget,
you could just tell
me. Just give a quick minute because I think we have 2 minutes to get through 2 questions.
Yeah, so Classic Law is a community legal assistance service. And so they provide a lot of free legal services, whether that's legal education or actual a lawyer going to court for you. They offer a ton of different things. They're located downtown in Saskatoon, and they do a lot of walk-in services. Classic actually would be probably another, outside of the residential tenancies, Office of Residential Tenancies, Classic is also a good resource to have in mind if you have a question that you need some clarification on. Classic is also a very good resource to reach out to, and it is also free legal service. So there is some parameters that they have with who they will assist, but again, you can always look into it and see if it's an option for you.
And then we have 1 minute. So I quickly found the answer to the other question is for assisted living, the landlord is the government. So the landlord on your contract, it can be the government, or it can be a nonprofit, or it can be a business, or it can be a person. Like I could be your landlord. But the important thing when you sign it is that it can be a corporation on the agreement. But if that's the case, they will direct you with a building manager or a rental manager. And that's who you're going to deal with about the terms in your contract. So even if the landlord isn't a person, it's an organization, they still will appoint a person who is your point of contact.
Looks like that's the end of the questions.
There was one at the beginning, at the very beginning. What about a personal care home? It flashed up on the screen, and it is here too. What about a personal care home? It's between assisted living and long-term care. And I think that you had said that that's not covered. That's covered by a different. It's not covered by the Residential Tendencies Act. It's covered by its own act.
Exactly.
Personal Care Home Act. Yeah.
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 Great. Well, I'm back. Jane's back. I'd like to thank everybody for their great questions. Every time we meet with Bridget and Taylor, we learn something, and we learned something from our viewers today too. So I just would really like to thank you, Elliot, for moderating today, and Bridget and Taylor for taking time out of a busy studying time of year to be with us. I also would like to thank the whole committee, Cynthia Johnson, who's the staff person that Elliot mentioned at the beginning. And Elliot and Bridget and Taylor and myself have been the subcommittee working on this. And I just would really like to thank everybody for the work that they've done on this. And we do have a brochure that Taylor and Bridget developed for us that will be, it will be online, I'm sure, but it'll also be available as one of the resources through the Saskatoon Council on Aging. So thank you everyone for being here. Our next coffee chat session will be held on April 1st with Dr. Megan O'Connell. We've had her in a couple of these chats, and she's going to talk to us that day about coping with isolation and developing resilience, which is a pretty relevant topic for us in this year of lockdown. And I'd also like to thank Virginia for doing the technology for this and getting us on and off screen appropriately, etc. Thanks for that, Virginia. I also would like to ask you to stay online after the webinar closes to answer a couple questions on a survey that we have so we can improve our sessions. And if you do so, you get to be entered into a draw for a $25 gift card. So I hope you'll do that. Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.